Thanks everybody for coming. We also have, beside Jamila Ewais, who is with us from Anti-Palestine and works for the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. She's in charge of their anti-Palestinian racism file. So she's going to be talking to us about anti-Palestinian racism. And we have Gord Doctorow, who has been, a lifelong activist and who has done a lot of work in solidarity with Palestine and works also with, I take it, Independent Jewish Voices.
Yeah,
and
I remember.
Yeah. And so Gord is here to talk about the work that he's been doing. So we're going to get underway, and I want to thank Jamila very much for joining us from Palestine. It's about, I think you said about 4 p.m. there, Jamila?
Yeah.
And so, we're very privileged to have her speaking to us from Palestine, and thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks. My name is John Price, by the way. I was the organizer, one of the organizers of this session, and Bianca was supposed to be moderating, but I'm standing in for her, so thank you for your patience. And thank you, Jamila, for joining us, and I turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this warm welcoming. So much. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the Anti-Palestinian Racism Project, or like program that we do at the Anti-Palestinian at the CGB Foundation, and the work we do on Anti-Palestinian racism and what we mean by Anti-Palestinian racism in general. Thank you for being here and listening to me, and basically. So over the past year, the Canadian public has witnessed a sharp and deeply troubling rise in anti-Palestinian racism. In homes, schools, workplaces, newsrooms, and legislators, Palestinian Canadians are being silenced, slandered, or erased. This is not a moment we can ignore. It's a moment that demands honesty and, above all, a commitment to justice. We're told that Canada is a country of diversity, inclusion, and human rights, yet Palestinian Canadians are often treated as an exception to these values. Their suffering is downplayed, their culture is pathologized, their very existence is politicized all the time. In response to this injustice, the CGB Foundation launched the Anti-Racism Program in early 2024. This initiative was born out of necessity to document, expose, and ultimately dismantle a system of racism that has been ignored far too long, and it's connected to Canada's foreign policy on Palestine and its support for Israel. Today's talk will examine how anti-Palestinian racism, what is it and how it works basically, and where it exists, and the work that the CGB Foundation actually work in confronting it, or that does confront this racism. So what do we mean by anti-Palestinian racism? I think a lot of people have been hearing this term for the past year and a half. So the term was coined firstly by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association in 2022 actually. It basically describe anti-Palestinian racism as a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians and their narratives, and defames them as like terrorists, anti-Semitic, or anti-democratic. The ACLA chose to describe rather than define anti-Palestinian racism because they acknowledge that the experiences of racism, especially like Palestinian experiences of racism, are left in context specific, and they also change over time. A flexible description empowers communities to articulate their own experiences rather than forcing them into a static legal box. So APR is not a new phenomenon. It existed for decades in Canada and elsewhere. And in Palestine, racism against the Palestinians is completely different than what the Palestinians actually witness in Canada. But it has long gone unnamed, making it harder to fight, harder to measure, and easier to deny, and at the same time always demand a definition to start talking about anti-Palestinianism on a government level. So anti-Palestinian racism is not the same also as Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism. They share some similarities, but they're not the same. Anti-Palestinian racism targets Palestinian identity, history, and expressions, target all of Palestinians and their allies. So basically someone who's wearing kufi could easily be attacked even though they are not Palestinian, or like you cannot say that you cannot identify them racially that they are Palestinian. It criminalizes solidarity, legitimizes advocacy, and punishes visibility, basically. So anti-Palestinian racism often begins with silencing. Palestinians are excluded from public panels, media debates, or classroom curricula. Their stories are deemed too political or too controversial. Their flags are banned. Their voices are dismissed as radical or dangerous. People who speak up for Palestine could be easily punished or disciplined or fired or forced to resign from their work, and that has been happening for over the last year in Canada, intensively, and is still undocumented. It also involves defamation and stereotyping. Palestinians are falsely labeled as anti-Semitic, violent, or inherently opposed to peace. This is not only, we're not talking about hurtful slurs here. There are strategic smears used to shut down advocacy, distort public perception, and discredit calls for justice. So APR also entail dehumanization. This can be explicit through hateful rhetoric that portrays Palestinians as animals or savages, or it could also be very subtle through media coverage that focuses on conflict rather than human suffering, or focusing on human suffering rather than other aspects of Palestinian story, or basically only covering the death of Palestinian women and children and not Palestinian men, for example. And perhaps more, and one of the most probably clear forms of anti-Palestinian racism is denying the Nakba and refusing to recognize the Nakba, which Canada has refused and is still refusing to do that. The catastrophic displacement of the Palestinians in 1948, and refusing to recognize it as a historical and ongoing injustice. So this not only distorts the past, it also supports the continuation of the violence against the Palestinian in the present and justifies it, basically. So what do we mean by the Palestine exception, or the Palestinian exception? The core concept in understanding anti-Palestinianism is Palestine exception. This term refers to the way advocacy for Palestinian rights is treated differently, held to different standards, punished more harshly, and excluded more readily than other human rights discourses. In Canada, we've seen politicians that have been censored or expelled for expressing support for Palestinians. Students have faced disciplinary actions for organizing Palestine-related events or displaying symbols like the kufiyya. Journalists and healthcare professionals have lost their work opportunities and jobs, and a lot of people have faced multiple levels or different levels of institutional retaliation. Even academic inquiry is not safe. Universities have been pressured to cancel exhibitions, lectures, and even research projects that center Palestinian voices. Meanwhile, pro-Palestinian protests are labeled as hate rallies, while the systemic silencing of Palestinians receive little public condemnation. This exceptionalism is not accidental. It reflects a deeply entrenched view that Palestinian identity is inherently suspect, and that the Palestinian resistance or refusal, no matter how peaceful or how grounded in international law, is a threat all the time. After October 7, 2023, the situation worsened dramatically. The CTV Foundation reported in 2023 988 incidents of anti-Palestinian racism in written content only, in part by media, basically. Nearly double the previous year, because we had also published a report in 2022, and it was 455 incidents, something like that. Incidents of censorship, slander, and surveillance skyrocketed as well. So the very act of naming Palestinian suffering basically is in itself treated as subversive. So now, what we do basically is to try to not only create awareness, but to create systemic change about anti-Palestinian racism. Because without this systemic change, nothing is going to change, and the Palestinians are going to keep witnessing all these incidents. So one of the things that we're doing is research and documentation, alongside our annual report, which is covering media narrative about the Palestine, the Palestinians, and media support for the genocide analysis. We're also working on other reports. In last month, we published a report on the impact of bubble zone and protest rights in Canada. that include Vaughan City, Brampton, and Oakville and Toronto. And there are like other cities who are considering like applying such laws. So this type of research, even though it's not directly connected to Palestine as like politicians say, but at the same time, like if you see the reasons and the justification behind it, you actually understand that if it wasn't about Palestine or like Palestinians, like they wouldn't issue such laws basically. And then the other thing is public education and engagement through our social media platforms. Now we have a post API and we have a website where people can access like multiple things, letters to school boards and media bias and different institutional failures. The other thing is we're working with the government to include anti-Palestinian racism in their anti-racism strategy and different governmental EDI frameworks and departments. So this is our way of doing things, and we're not taking like any other radical measurements at the organization or stances, because we believe, the organization believes that this is the way to support all Canadians and different communities in Canada, basically. So if we want to talk about like the institutional and everyday harm of anti-Palestinian racism, so in schools we're talking about people like students were asked to move Palestinian flags and kufiyas. Teachers are warned against discussing the Nakba, even the entire, what they call it, like during last November, there was a day to remember like the soldiers who fell in battle, and then one of the schools, like because of an incident in school that played like a song against the genocide, they actually the ministry in the provincial ministry in Toronto, they changed the entire law to strictly only play Canadian songs during that day, even though like the year before that at the same school, a different school in the same province, people played Ukrainian songs on the Memorial Day and nothing happened, basically. In the media, we're talking about coverage often frames Palestinians as aggressor or ignore their death and suffering, or only focus on the suffering part all the time and remove their agency as well. Basically, in politics, we're talking about like lots of lobby groups, pro-Israeli lobby groups like CIJA and many within Canada that not only like oppose supporting Palestinian rights, but also they oppose the recognition of anti-Palestinian racism, and instead of calling for justice and support for all communities, they claim that anti-Palestinian racism is anti-Semitic, basically. In public life, anti-Palestinian racism manifests as hate crimes, harassment, vandalism, and surveillance. Protests are heavily policed, Palestinian symbols are misinterpreted as signs of hate, and everyday Canadians face social exclusion for expressing solidarity, basically. So, like in the face of all these challenges, there are like two strategies that in general we are doing at the program and like we're trying to implement. We're basically connecting bottom up and top down strategies. So bottom up strategies by working with the community and documenting what's happening and working with different allied groups on different topics and pressuring like institutions on the ground. That could be school boards, that could also be hospitals, that could be EDI frameworks or like departments. That could be like multiple things that ordinary people can reach. And then we have a top-down strategy, which is basically working with representatives from the government and prime minister and trying to align our goals with their political goals in order to get anti-Palestinian racism to be recognized and defined within the anti-racism strategy, like the Canadian racism strategy. Basically. I feel like I'm gonna leave it here. I tried to summarize what we do more than what anti-Palestinian racism and how we also view anti-Palestinian racism as well, and the work that we do about it, on it. There's in Canada, there's lots of work on anti-Palestinian racism. and it's really one of the most advanced countries on this topic, basically, which is really good. It's so advanced to the extent that even the UN is now consulting Canadian literature on anti-Palestinian racism and all of that, which is this is a great achievement actually. So I'm gonna leave it here. Thank you so much, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Jamila. I'm going to turn over the moderation to Bianca Mugyenyi, who has arrived, and very pleased to have you, Bianca.
Thank you. I'm so
Thank you
sorry.
much.
I'm so sorry for my late arrival.
Not at all.
Jeez. Yeah.
Great. And so, Jamila, thank you so much. Just for people who just came in late, Jamila is in Palestine right now, and so it's 4 o'clock there, and yeah, she made the special effort to participate in our session today from Palestine in order to talk about anti-Palestinian racism. So thank you so much, Jamila.
Thank you.
So appreciated. And I'll turn it over to Bianca to see how she wants to proceed. Actually, you can stay there, Bianca,
Okay.
because
You can see you from here.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Hi,
you can-
Jamila. Thank you so much
Hi.
for. I don't know if you can see me. Hold on.
Thanks.
Let's see. Yeah, that's a bit
Yeah, now
better.
I can.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you
Hi.
for those incredibly powerful reflections, and it's extremely encouraging to hear that the world is learning from Canada how to combat anti-Palestinian racism. That's a silver lining for me, that's for sure. So again, my apologies for being here late. I don't know Toronto very well. I got pretty lost and turned around. Thank you, John, for holding down the fort. It's a team effort. I appreciate it. Thank you also, Gord, for stepping in so last minute for this important discussion, and to everyone for coming as well. It's really good to see the interest in a panel like this. So before Gord speaks, I thought that I would do a little bit of the framing that I was thinking about doing in advance. I think people know that this is a roundtable, so we'll be hearing from our speakers, and then hopefully having a bit of a discussion, mostly between the two of you. And then it would be great if we could bring in everybody as well to just to talk about these important issues, and also to get reflections about how these issues are impacting you, your communities, and so on and so forth. So I'm Bianca Mugyenyi. I'm the former director of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is an organization that was really committed to exposing, among other things, the racism that's embedded in Canadian foreign policy, and also involved with Canada-China Focus, which is trying to deepen its understanding of Canada's relationship with China, like beyond the Cold War, panic narratives and fear campaigns, among other things. So I'm just, like I said, I'm really hoping that we can have some shared reflection and dialogue. I also want to thank John for organizing this panel and for bringing us together. And I also want to acknowledge that Genling Chen was scheduled to speak on behalf of Alpha Education, but is unfortunately ill and unable to join us today. So in terms of questions that I think are important for us to have on our mind for today's discussion, obviously I come from a bit of a foreign policy lens, and so really sort of thinking about like how do our foreign policies harm racialized communities, right? And so not only abroad, but also here at home. And I think this is important in many ways. People talk about how for foreign policy it's difficult to organize because we don't have a constituency here at home. But I think that we need to challenge that. I think discussions like this show that there is a lot of potential for organizing, and people are directly impacted here. And I think also really urgently, it's important for us to be discussing how our communities, whether Palestinian or Black, Chinese, Haitian, or Jewish and beyond, can unite across these experiences as well, and become a bit of a force as well to counter the racism and the violence both here and abroad. So I think discussions like this are extremely, extremely important because while racism pervades Canada's role abroad, our foreign policy, it's actually not discussed comprehensively, really at all. And I think that it is, in fact, a deeper understanding of Canada's foreign policy that is actually key to building the kind of solidarity that comes from seeing how interconnected all of these struggles are, right? Whether it's xenophobia or anti-Palestinian racism, whether it's Canadian mining interests that are displacing Indigenous communities around the world, or even here at home in Canada. And also just I think the narratives are starting to shift. We're seeing that. But I think that we still have a lot of doublespeak. Canada's foreign policy speaks the language of peace, it speaks the language of democracy and human rights, but increasingly we're seeing pushback from folks like Jamila, Tyler Shipley. I don't know if people are familiar with his book. He writes that Canada's actual history is not that of peacekeeper, but of a junior partner in empire. And that empire also has, it has terrible, terrible, terrible consequences globally and internationally, but it also has domestic consequences, and ones that run really deep, and also that I think expose the racial hierarchies that are at the heart of the Canadian state as well. Other things that I think are important to reflect upon is the direct line from Canada's violence abroad to repression at home, and also to our founding, right? So from the stolen land of Indigenous nations, and then more recently with criminalization of Black communities, and then as Jamila had talked about, silencing voices who speak up for Palestine, or who challenge dominant narratives, including about places like China. A lot of backlash for that, a lot of repercussions for standing up. So, when Canada backs a coup in Haiti, for instance, which is actually how I became involved in foreign policy, I was very concerned about what I was seeing happening in Haiti, especially as a Black person with a lot of love and affinity for Haiti, seeing the racism that was being perpetrated across our borders. So seeing the coup that happened there, and the undermining of democracy, and then, in modern day, today, seeing the deportation of Haitians from our own borders, seeing how Canada supports Israeli apartheid, and then surveils Palestinians who speak out, and again, seeing how it demonizes China, just as another example, and then Chinese Canadians are treated as potential threats. So it's not a good situation, and it's a really racialized domestic policy. So just one example that I wanted to bring up that I just found so stark was even in the midst right now of Israel's ongoing assault in Gaza, where there's tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed, maybe hundreds of thousands. Canada's immigration policy shows stark discrimination, right? So we have 5,000 temporary visas that were promised to Palestinians, but fewer than 334 have actually made it to Canada. And this isn't because of Israel or Egyptian obstruction in this particular case. It's Canada's own security vetting. So this is a Canadian problem. And then meanwhile, you see special programs for Israeli nationals, offering fee-exempt 3-year work and study permits that has already benefited thousands. And then Jamila had also mentioned the double standards with Ukraine. We saw similar double standards where Canada welcomed 300,000 Ukrainians, while Palestinians fleeing genocide are blocked by all kinds of bureaucratic barriers. So in Montreal, I've been seeing a lot of protest outside Mark Miller's office, the immigration officer, and I think that's the kind of action we need to continue to see. So anyway, I'll just sort of stop there because we do want to hear from Gord as well. Gord brings a really important perspective of anti-Zionist Jewish solidarity, rather. Gord, are you a part of IJV?
Oh, yes,
Independent Jewish Voices?
absolutely.
Okay, yeah, so Gord is a part of IJV, and they've been challenging, both anti-Semitism and the weaponization of Jewish identity to silence dissent. So I'm very excited to hear from you, Gord. Yeah, I'll hand it over to you before we discuss further. Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say it's a real honor to hear Jamila and to hear what's happening. It's fantastic. That's all I can say. Let me talk a little bit about IJV. First of all, I came to IJV and its predecessor because I'm Jewish, I'm a socialist, and an anti-imperialist and anti-racist. And that's what IJV stands for. I'm not an outlier. That's where we come from. Now, mind you, not all IJVers are socialists, but they lean to the left. And we have a statement or a framework that we express in our documents. I won't go through all of it, but essentially it goes through that idea of social justice, and we're committed to it. And I just want to say, as a historical footnote, that the Jewish traditions were very ably expressed by Isaac Deutscher, Marxist Jewish historian many years ago, in which he said, in the history of Jews, you had those who sided with the ruling class as a means of trying to protect themselves, and then there were the rebels, and you know who they are. Rosa Luxemburg, Marx, Trotsky, whatever, all these people who express themselves as hostile to the regime. And their belief, and this is the belief of IJV, is that solidarity with all those who are oppressed is our best defense. That's right. And those who solidarize with the ruling classes often wind up being victims of the ruling class. That happened in Germany and other places. IJV has a lot of activist work, and what I'll do is I'll outline some of the things I've been involved in. In the Toronto District School Board, for a long time, there was a Jewish Zionist group there that dominated, and APR was very much part of their approach, including things like canceling a speaker so that the Zionists could be there and that kind of thing. However, that's changed. Within the TDSB, there is now a Jewish families group which are pro-Palestinian, and we work with them. We have some influence amongst the trustees, which is developing. It's taken a long time, long time. And we've been working with Palestinians, Palestinian families, to do things like vetting the trustees, like representing, deputizing, to express our views as Jews against the exclusion of Palestinian voices, against the things that have been done against Palestinians that to a large extent have been buried, and we bringing them out into the open. We have also fought within other school boards against, and that one too, against IHRA resolutions. Sometimes we succeeded, but even when we haven't succeeded, we've raised a big fuss, and I can see that some of the trustees that we were not able to influence are now being influenced because as things evolve, and that's because we have a persistent presence with our Palestinian partners. We have an anti-IHRA campaign, a group across the country, and we discuss national, well, actually I shouldn't say national, pan-Canadian. I hate that term national because it's not one nation, but anyway. So a pan-Canadian group, from Halifax, as well as other parts of the country. And we deal with this issue in legal terms and other terms as well. We also have a struggle against the idea of limiting the capacity to have protests and encampments. And that's very recent. It's come out in the so-called bubble zones. Marketing device. Anyway, as you probably all know, that means that there's attempts started up in Vaughan and now in Toronto and some other places to limit the ability of us to have protests in favor of Palestinian rights. And it was justified, the weaponizing that's done by Zionism because of vulnerable institutions. And as my friend Sue Goldstein says, the biggest vulnerable institution is democracy, and that's being attacked. And we've been doing lobbying, and we've had some success. We were able to get the original plan whittled down, but we have a long way to go. I think it's an ongoing struggle. We have an IJV book club where we talk about Palestinian literature as well as some Jewish literature. And that's to familiarize ourselves and to work with Palestinian partners. We have fought against charitable status for Zionist organizations, such as the
JNF?
Yeah, the Jewish National Fund, which has been exposed for what it is. We are very involved in BDS campaigns. I'm involved in that, which has to do with things like boycotts, demonstrations, public education. We work with other groups. There's quite a few groups in the Toronto area, GTA, and we're part of that. And so we help to hand out literature, buttons, whatever, film showings. We've been involved in film showing. Again, we partnered with other organizations, Palestinian, non-Jewish, and Jewish. And so the idea is to create the sense that this is beyond, just one group. We also, of course, try to explain things along some of the lines that Jamila talked about. So, for example, we talk about the fact that anti-Palestinian racism is not the same as Islamophobia. Those are different things. And I don't have to explain it to you, but there are people who don't understand that. And the people that we work with who are Muslims understand that. They agree. So, and this is amazing because what we're doing is we're getting people who've never worked together before starting to talk and inform each other and finding very pleasant relationships. I'm also a retired teacher in the Toronto District School Board, and so I've been involved in a campaign to divest the plan, the teacher's pension plan, from investments in Israeli destined weaponry and stuff like that. So we have a very good group, and we demonstrate in front of the building, the big shiny building, and we've disrupted the general meetings twice and created quite a fuss. And it was amazing. There was a little bit of pushback, but for the most part, I think people were starting to open their eyes. They had no idea, that we are funding scholasticide. We're teachers who are funding scholasticide, the destruction of universities and schools and shooting kids. Yeah, they needed to know that. That's where our money is going. Yes, we've also, and now I'll finish with that. So some of the public events we've had a Refusnik event where we had a couple of Jewish Israelis who've refused to serve in the army, and they've come across Canada and they've done a tour to explain why they're Refusniks. We've shown the film The Tree, which is an expose of by a Jewish author who talks about his experience of having been given a bar mitzvah gift of a tree in Israel. And then he finds out that it wasn't Israel, it was Palestine, and that his land that was confiscated, razed, and so on. And it's his voyage of understanding, and he interviews Palestinians as well as Jews. We've had other films that we've co-sponsored with other groups that are active in the Toronto area, especially in the East End. And yeah, so those are the things we've done, and we're committed on the basis, finally, I should say this, is that our safety as Jews is tied up to the safety of Palestinians, is tied up to the safety of all people who are racialized, excluded, marginalized, and that is our only hope. And so we stand together with Palestinians and all other racialized groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gord, for those powerful reflections, and Jamila for your powerful reflections. So we're going to shift into a bit more of a conversational mode, and I'm just going to pose a few questions that I'm hoping will help us explore some of the connections. Like I said earlier, we are missing some of our speakers, so it's going to be a little bit of a different conversation. But I think it's important for us to continue exploring our experiences and think together about building solidarity. So that includes, the communities represented by the speakers in the room, but even beyond that, I think in terms of our what we're thinking. So one of the things that I'm wondering, when you two were kind of listening to each other's presentations, I'm wondering if there are any similarities that you saw, or anything that really resonated for you in terms of the ways in which these policies create harm for your communities.
Well, I do think that it creates harm. Jews as a whole are being held to account by the Zionists, and the Christian Zionists especially, to be responsible for the crimes that Israel's committed. And I just want to tell you that years ago, when I was on a trip to Germany, I noticed that the younger people had all this graffiti denouncing the previous generation, because they were the people who were being felt responsible for the crimes that their elders had committed. And I see this happening again. So, this weaponization affects Jews in ways that many of us don't understand. But certainly the Palestinian community understands it. They feel it. And it seems like, it's like we're dumping our guilt onto another group, especially in Germany. Oh, we're not responsible for the Holocaust, or if we were, it's because we're giving that up now. We're going to support Israel, and it's the Palestinians who are the problem. Our guilt goes away. We're washing our guilt onto the Palestinians, and this is horrific.
I agree, and it's not only that, it's also like, in one way or another, even domestic policies, as you said, Bianca, they definitely have foreign policies interests, but even foreign policy interests have definitely like domestic policies interests. And Canada, by silencing Palestinians and the pro-Palestinians, they're not only trying to protect Israel, like support Israel, they're even protecting their own government who are like making these decisions in one way or another. So this decision at the end of the day is just like a domestic interest for the government. And its allies at the end of the day, and its relationships on the global sphere, basically. But at the same time, like these policies are too harmful, because in one way or another, like you're asking the people that they should leave their own country, but once they leave, you're not even welcoming them. And at the same time, people who live inside these countries are asked to never have full affiliation to it, to always be connected to some land that probably they have never been to, or something like that. So like to basically ask a group of people to have all these contradictions, it's basically very harmful for them. And it's really important for the two groups to work together to combat that, if that makes sense.
Following on from that, in terms of the domestic ramifications, we've talked a lot about the surveillance, the criminalization that's happening on campuses, the protests, and even in daily life. And Gord, you had said something about the erosion of democracy that's happening, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that as well, just in terms of the domestic realities that we're seeing from these policies and the impact beyond the Jewish community, beyond the Palestinian community, and for all of us?
Well, I can start with the IHRA definition, so-called definition. What it does is it criminalizes any attempt to criticize Israel, to support Palestinians. And in fact, it implies that all Palestinians are anti-Semites because, well, you can read it yourself. It's an absurdity. But it's an erosion of democracy in that sense. But the bubble zones concept, it's a fundamental denial of our constitutional rights of free expression. And it means that there's a foreign country that is able to interfere in our country and in the US to decide what our rights are to be. And that they, when they talk about foreign interference, they never mention Israel, which is the biggest foreign interferer of all. But I want to also say that when we say that, we also must recognize there's the facade and then there's the real essence. And the essence is US imperialism. And the other imperialisms that benefit from the arms trade. So Israel becomes the front for that. And that is a danger to the Jews as well as the Palestinians, because we're being blamed, Jews are being blamed for all this erosion of this attack against rights. And the tropes about Jews is that they control the world. They control the banks, they control this. And it feeds right into real anti-Semitism. And so if you want to see a rise in, you talk about the rise in anti-Semitism, it really is from the right wing. But the Zionists keep saying it's from the left. Why? Because they criticize Israel. That's the new anti-Semitism. It's damn well new because it doesn't exist. But it's a way in which democracy is being subverted in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, and everybody who is a victim of it suffers for that.
I'm seeing that there's an erosion of democracy, and like an erosion of rights, and that the repercussions of the anti-Palestinian racism have an impact on everyone in Canada, like anyone who values their rights, their freedom of speech, their freedom to assemble, and so on and so forth. So just wanting to hear any of your reflections on that and about why everybody who's living in this country should be extremely concerned about the erosion of their rights, even if, beyond the moral clarity of supporting the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah. This is a very good question. Because in order that, yes, Palestine is the exception at the moment, and Palestinians' rights are the exception at the moment. But if you look at, in the past, and you look at similar incidents, we see that we have ordinary people who have literally been fighting to get Canada to stop, getting involved in apartheid or different Canadian institutions, apartheid in South Africa, or other war crimes in different countries in one way or another. And every single time we have this huge movement that takes over places, and at the same time create movement, they get backlash, they get silence, they get repressed at the same time. So yes, Palestine is the exception at the moment because Palestine is the negation of all these violations of international law and even domestic law. And they're definitely going to impact everyone who's calling for upholding church rights, and at the same time upholding democratic values for everyone in Canadian society. So instead of just so Canada, instead of listening to its own people, the Canadian government, on all levels, provincial level, even federal level, even sometimes municipal level, instead of listening to the communities, staying with them, literally just listening to their demands, they're just no, we're going to use the law and the legal system to basically repress you. And then right another, a lot of people are not aware how this is going to impact them in the future, but in the future it's going to have more and more impact. Because let's say about when we talk about bubble zone law, for example, let's say that we have a group of indigenous people who wanted to protest outside the church for unmarked graves in one way or another, or indigenous children who were taken by one of the a church or somewhere in Canada, what would happen to them? Would that be a violation in one way or another? So like lots of questions on such laws, and it's simply not going to impact only Palestinians, it's going to impact everyone. And it's so sad that politicians don't even see that. It's so sad for them. They're like, no, this is our way of keeping everyone safe. But like, you cannot keep everyone safe by limiting their freedom, and at the same time, like their way of expressing themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Well said, John.
Yeah, thanks, Jamila. I just wanted to express my appreciation for all the work that Jamila and CJPME is doing, because it's you know, like the very idea of having to define anti-Palestinian racism as a specific phenomenon is like really, really important, because we live in a fairly complex world, right? And so getting to these points to understand what's actually happening requires some understanding and analysis. And I raise this because the bubble zone question is not so easy, because I was involved in the struggles around abortion, right? And in British Columbia, we established bubble zones to protect clinics, right? Where women were going to have abortions, right?
Yeah.
And those bubble zones were established in order to stop the harassment by the pro-lifers, right? And so, you know, it can cut both ways, right? And that's the, you know, why we need to really be, you know, have some depth to understand. We have to go right down to what are we talking about here. In the case of the bubble zones around synagogues, it's a question not because it's, you know, it's because what's endangering synagogues is Zionism and bringing over, you know, Israeli soldiers or whoever, right, that are, you know, to perpetuate genocide. That's the problem. And so, you know, protecting that is different than protecting a woman's right to abortion, right? And so we have to be able to, you know, liberalism is very tricky that way. We have to have, you know, the analysis to be able to combat this stuff. And the latest thing, I'll shut up, but
Please keep speaking.
yeah, the new laws that were just passed yesterday on the borders, right? There's the new powers. I haven't gone through it. I just read quickly the newspaper headlines, but it looks like just horrific stuff has been passed in terms of documentation and people coming into the country, and it's like, you know, it's gotten worse. And so this rise of Canadian nationalism can really, you know, there's times when it's good, like around Iraq. For instance, in 2003, there was a lot of us in the streets where we were talking about stopping the invasion of Iraq, and it was sort of anti-US imperialist, and it was sort of Canadian nationalist, right? The UN didn't support the invasion, and therefore we weren't going to support it, and so that was great, and we had huge demonstrations, right? We had, in Vancouver, biggest demonstration, 50,000 people in the streets in Vancouver. Out of it came Stop War. There was a whole anti-war movement, right, that grew up out of that, which was fabulous. Here we've got, you know, a tougher struggle, right? Much tougher struggle, and Canadian nationalism is actually working against us, you know? And so, yeah, it's, so.
Thank you for that important.
In Toronto in 1995, I think around that, there was like a bombing of one of the abortion clinics. But then the response was just like a bubble zone, even though the actor was an individual who went to the clinic, who went inside the clinic and did the bombing. I mean, like, a bubble zone law would never protect people from such actions. Like, how would you know that one person would actually get inside and do that? Like, are they going to be joining a protest, or like, are they going to be joining a group or something? Like, that's never going to happen, basically. A protest will never basically start throwing grenades or bombs inside a place out of nowhere. But an individual could do that, and a bubble zone law is not the response to such measurements, basically. But then the response of the provincial government at that time, that was in Toronto, so like the Ontario government was to pass a bubble zone law to protect the abortion clinics against bombing.
Yeah.
Like, that makes no sense.
Yeah, John, you mentioned the liberalism, Jamila, you mentioned the need for more complex systems thinking, right? And, I agree, it's not just let's blame the white people, but can we talk about white supremacy, right? And the political education that's required for people to see how this is impacting them. So, the white supremacy or the imperialism or the economic interests that might be, I don't even know the word really for what's happening in Gaza, but having the kind of impact we're seeing in Gaza or the kind of impact that we're seeing in the Chinese communities in Canada, they're connected, right? And so how do we get people to see that? What are these systems that need to be named, and how do we do that? No, it's terrible. I would love to go back to Gord and Jamila, just in response to the question that we got. Sorry, could you let us know your name?
Terry.
From Terry. Very important question about these divisions and about the racisms between, and how do we care? How do we foster the solidarity in communities where that has been chipped away?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Now we're working, there's not a report, but it could be a policy brief that we're working on hate crimes, and in Canada and Palestine. And this is really important because it's actually by design to getting these groups to be apart and work always apart is by design. And that means that in one way or another, if you want to work against racism, against anti-hate, most of the working groups on ground, we're not talking about communities, we're talking about let's say working group, that's what we do as an NGO, we work with other NGOs. They get their funding from the government. So the government has very, very small limited resources to distribute different groups around Canada basically. But in one way or another, you have to leverage your own issue above other people's issues to be able to get funding. So basically, this type of design is putting all these communities in competition with one another rather than getting them actually to work together. So as a Palestinian, I would be prioritizing Palestinian anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Palestinian training, anti-Palestinian hate. As as a Muslim, I would be working in Muslim groups. As someone who comes from let's say other backgrounds, I would be we're working on other backgrounds in one way or another, rather than just it's not about ethnic backgrounds. It could be gender division. It could be also ages and generational divisions, all these things. So instead of finding a more complicated ways of working together, we would have to work separately in order to get this funding, because we always have to submit clear results all the time in order to get to be part of that system. So this is also a great question because it's really challenging for us to work with people who are not who are not Palestinians or Arabs and Muslims. Not because we cannot work with them, but because it's really hard to find such groups. So far, when it comes to NGO scene in Canada, there are little NGOs that have bought, not so many have actually bought any statements on the genocide in Gaza. And we're talking about people who are working on human rights. We're talking about people who are working with different communities and all of that. But most of them are not even able to speak on Palestine because most of them get their funding also from the government. So there's also lots of challenging that we're thinking of and how to break it. But I think in a way or another, the movement in ground, let's say PYM and other groups that are working on the ground, even IGB, have some success in achieving these solidarities when it comes to the Palestine issue, because they have been able to bring together multiple people from different backgrounds, from also different ways of thinking and all of these things. So I think we have limited success, but at the same time, we still don't have really a clear way on how to do that. And at the same time, even within the Muslim community and the Arab community, there are people who would say, yes, why should we care? We're not Palestinian, we're not going through this, we live in Canada, and all of these things. So you also have the day-to-day life challenges that people are also going through, and it's really hard to find a way to get them to care about lots of issues. So yeah, I think I'm sure this is not an answer, but I'm just like looking at our experience.
That's so comprehensive and thoughtful. Thank you so much, Jamila. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It is exactly what we're talking about in terms of what needs to be done in terms of the political education. I want to thank you, Gord. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to everyone who shared your questions and your thoughts about solidarity and about intersectionality. It was a really brilliant conversation. I know I'm going away thinking more about systems and solidarity and labor and these strategic connections that we have to make, and also how to do political and education in a way that connects, right? And that's culturally relevant, and that communicates our inherent human dignity, right? And the very simple idea that every life must be valued the same, whether in Canada or abroad. So just thank you, John, for organizing this panel. Thank you to everyone. I really, really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you.